Okay. All right. Well, for a change of pace, this is something that's been largely overlooked so far. That is the iconic, wettest and most important forest types for which the Otways are quite unique. And in my little summary that I've posted into the material that you'll see behind the scenes, the abstracts, I made the comment, very brief comment, that the Otways rainforests are unique in regards to the dominant overstory species. There is only one at maturity. That makes it uniquely susceptible to one of the most important threats that I've spent a significant part of my research career investigating, and that is the impact on forest composition of myrtle wilt. So what I'm going to do in my presentation is say a lot less, because I don't have time, about how we initially identify what is a rainforest and how to identify different types. But more importantly, because of the significance of various threats now posing great existential risk for rainforests in particular, I'm going to focus on these key threats, commenting only in passing that land clearance has been the greatest threat in the past, historically. Whole regions of the Otway rainforest area have been completely eliminated. You'll see that from a screenshot in a moment. Forestry, as has been commented earlier, has been a very important impact in the past. We're in a state of recovery from that. Theoretically, very little of the prime mature rainforest was meant to have been cut in that period, but the impacts were very significant. The one I want to spend most time emphasizing in this presentation will be myrtle wilt, which, as I say, these rainforests are uniquely susceptible to for a reason I'll explain when I get there. And finally, climate change and fire. Fire's been really the major theme so far. It will become so for the rainforest in the future, and I'll attempt to illustrate that with what's happened elsewhere in the state. And if I get time, I'll also cover the impending scenario of sambar spread throughout the Otways, which is really only at this point incipient. It's hardly there, but it is there. Right, a statewide overview, simply to say that there's been reports produced by my department. My colleagues have produced this report, Victoria's rainforests being evaluated in terms of imagery and so on. And the outcome is that rainforests at the moment occupy less than they have occupied 0.153% of the state. At one point, when I was doing my earlier work, I worked 5 years towards a PhD on Victoria's rainforests. At that point, you could actually, from a 1 to 100,000 mapping perspective, push all of Victoria's rainforests onto French Island and it would sail away. It could have fitted on French Island. Now there's probably only half of that left, much less than the area of French Island. How do you know what type of rainforest you're in? Well, you can use some guidelines such as a report that I produced. I produced my department's official field guide to rainforest identification in Victoria using a method which I developed way back in the 1980s using differential species, a very different system to the way plant communities have traditionally been diagnosed in terms of consistency of species. This was to do with fidelity and species that are found uniquely in one community versus another. So I've actually got this copy and happy to leave that for the community down here if you don't already have a copy. Secondly, there's a very compendious volume by my colleague Bill Peel, which is this book. Have I already somehow accidentally skipped? No, I haven't. So I'll just show you this screen first. This is the Rainforests and Cool Temperate Mixed Forests of Victoria by my colleague Bill Peel. There's also several other things, material that Monash University produced of mine back in 1992. And then there's other departmental publications or booklets on the subject of what sort of rainforests we've got. But in order to know what type of rainforest we're looking at, I want to just make a clear distinction that in the cool temperate rainforests of Victoria, the key dominants are either myrtle beech, the only one in the Otways. Southern sassafras joins it throughout central Victoria, that is the Central Highlands, the Strzelecki's, Wilson Promontory. It used to be at near Cape Otway, one herbarium specimen back in the 1800s it appears to have gone extinct, probably because of that early period of very extensive removal of landscape, particularly the Air Valley plantation and the area around beech forest. That's probably why there's no sassafras or atherosperma left in the Otways. Black oliveberry replaces Nothofagus in East Gippsland, and together with southern sassafras, atherosperma, they are the two co-dominants in the East Gippsland rainforest. The warm temperate rainforests of Victoria, which I spent so much of my career studying, are dominated typically by lily pilly, but significantly also by blackwood, which is a very important species featuring in the Otways, but largely as a result of a history of disturbance, particularly fire, and clearance of landscapes, after which eucalypts cannot return because their seeds don't last as long, but blackwood, like most acacias, their seeds remain in the soil for generations and will come back as soon as there is fire. So this is what warm temperate rainforests look like. They are identified particularly by a key element, that is the special life form we call the vines, the climbing plants, the lianes, various different terms used, and you can see that they completely interconnect the canopies of the trees that's on the riverbank in East Gippsland. That's what warm temperate rainforest looks like. Then we have this unique type of rainforest. I introduced the term dry rainforest to Victoria back in the 80s for the first time, and they're very, very tiny pinpricks in the landscape, but incredibly important because they illustrate a continuity of rainforest types with all of the other states of Australia, except South Australia and Tasmania, obviously. So they are found in places like the Mitchell River Gorge, the top screen, and the top photo, the middle photo, and a unique place further north in East Gippsland in the Buchan district. There is a place called the Pyramids on the Murrindle River, and inside a crater-like doe line, there is a very significant stand of dry rainforest that you can see in the bottom right. And that photograph was taken looking down inside the top of that hill. So that's dry rainforest. Now let's go to focus on cool temperate rainforest, Nothofagus cunninghami, which some people in other countries have now put into a different genus. I won't toil over the taxonomic distinctions. We have two genera in Australia, only one in Victoria, Nothofagus cunninghami, myrtle beech, keystone species in cool temperate rainforests for a wealth of dependent epiphytes, another key life form along with vines in rainforests across the globe, and also for shade-tolerant and shade-dependent understory species. There's an illustration where there's both the sassafras with the very pointy crowns and the beech trees at a site near the Ada tree. So that's just cool temperate rainforest in general. The interior of the rainforest, as in the Otways, are like this. They're an absolute wealth of bryophytes, which is mosses and liverworts, other cryptogamic flora, such as, well, there's fungi. We might or might not choose to call them flora. They're as if they come from another planet, but they're more closely related to animals than to plants. So these are the habitats in which the cryptogamic flora excels over the vascular flora. And when I did very intensive plot monitoring to assess the impact of myrtle wilt, mostly in the Otways, but also in the Central Highlands, my team and I found that there were 2 to 5 times as many species of bryophytes alone. That's without even looking at the fungi, the lichens, which are connecting fungi with algae. You know, there's 2 kingdoms wrapped up in a single organism there for lichens. And even just looking at the bryophytes, which is most of that green stuff growing over everything, 2 to 5 times the biodiversity was wrapped up in the bryophytes alone. That is the lowest level of that triangle where we have the vascular flora at the top and we have the bryophytes at the bottom. That's the bottom end of the oldest members of the plant kingdom. So that diversity is extraordinary and has been understood in Europe and in Britain, less so in North America, and hardly until recently in Australia, that the bryophytes in particular, along with lichens and other cryptogamic flora, are actually extremely important biological indicators of change. So if you want to know what's happened to pollution, you go and look at what sort of things are growing, black or white or whatever, in places like England. elsewhere where these things have been studied. But in Australia, I was choosing to include bryophytes for the first time in monitoring work, assessing them along with the vascular flora, and to our shock and horror, over a 2-year period, I became a competent bryologist, which was a huge learning curve. Nearly all of the biodiversity and the indicators of change are wrapped up in this lowest level, which most self-respecting botanists ignore. But I've put myself on this steep learning curve. Let me try and move on faster. Now, Nothofagus is a very important genus in respect to how long it lasts in the landscape. I regard this genus, which is Gondwanic, and it has its representatives in Tasmania, mainland Australia, New Zealand, it's very diverse. Patagonia, other regions of South America, it's very diverse. It may have been in South Africa, it's not there now, and we don't know if it was ever in India, unless the palynological record might prove that to us. So my point here is that this is a very ancient genus. It's it's now been split into 4 genera, but we have 2 of them in Australia. One of them is Phascospora, the other one is Lophozonia. This species is Lophozonia, one of the 2 in mainland Australia. But my point here is this has been around over those endless fluctuations in climate, which we learned earlier, Michael spoke about, is that right? So going back probably not just the period of time over which humans have been in Australia, and that's contestable whether that goes back only to 60 to 70,000 years. Who were those people who lit fires down at Warrnambool 110 to 120,000 years ago? I asked that question myself. I don't think we have any idea yet. But the point is that over periods of 30 to 50 million years, the rainforest vegetation of Australia included in various areas Nothofagus species, and here we have one in the Otways. Now, up in northern New South Wales on the Queensland border, I photographed this species, Antarctic beech Nothofagus. Well, if we keep that genus, otherwise Phascospora, that species is Nothofagus mori. And that species illustrates perfectly the capacity for these massive, almost lignotuberous trees to re-sprout repeatedly from almost lignotuber-like masses, so that if there is a massive storm, if there is insect attack, if there is a fire, whatever the reason that the crown may be killed, they will re-sprout from the base over successive generations. And this is what I regard as a genetically conservative strategy. If something's worked well for 30 or 50 million years, stick with it. Make your individuals outlast shorter perturbations in climate. And this is what Nothofagus has done perfectly, including here in the Otway. So now let's look at the distribution of Nothofagus-dominated rainforests in the Otways. It's the blue stuff. There's sites of significance which I identified in 1990 for all of Victoria. I identified 110 of these. There are a number of them in the Otways. One, the Olangala catchment, because of its lack of logging history, because it was a water catchment, preserves a virtually it's an untampered with catchment, so it gets national significance. A number of others have state significance and some have regional significance. So I identified and delineated and rated all these sites of significance for rainforests right across Victoria. These are the ones I identified in the Otways. You also see there's a big gap there. Does this let me? Do I have a pointer? I don't know if I do. It doesn't matter. Without a pointer, you can see that south of what it says is Ferguson in the beech forest area, between the head of the air catchment. In fact, the head of the air catchment is in the area without rainforest because of the Air Valley plantation, and the headwaters up towards beech forest. We have a township named for this species I'm talking about, but there's no rainforest left. It's been completely eliminated by early settlement history. So the first impact on these rainforests and their continuity was, of course, land clearance. After that, it was all different manner of logging activity. I don't have the time to go into how that would have affected these forests, other than to say, at this point in time, unless we get a change of government and they reintroduce, another government could reintroduce native forest logging. But at this point, we don't have logging in the Otways except on private land. Now, why is this not moving for me? Where's Jack when you need him most? I'm pressing this button here and it's not moving my slide. What's happened to me?
think you're brave to expect that I can fix it.
Well, I want to go on. I'm not ready to finish yet.
Is that next?
I hope so.
5 minutes.
Okay.
Right.
What? 5 minutes? Oh, that's impossible. Oh, sorry. I'll have to go so fast you'll never believe this. I've got to get past all of this. Okay, Eucalyptus regnans is the world's tallest tree. Everybody, including the Americans, who like to think their trees are the tallest, of course, Trump would prefer that. The tallest trees by far, 500 footers, were in Victoria. So I don't have time to tell you about that, but there's a tabulation. 500 footers, the world's tallest tree was the Ferguson tree near Hillsville. A colleague of mine did a paper in the Victorian Naturalist all about this it was a centennial issue, 2 of them, in fact, in a row, about the Baron von Mueller influence on Victorian botany. There's a logging track next to Nothofagus mixed forest, as it happens, just to illustrate that rainforest and logging have been closely intertwined throughout Victoria. Then we have the importance of blackwood, which comes back after you've disturbed rainforest, and you'll end up with sites that were previously mature rainforest now dominated by blackwood. I don't have time to say more about that. Then we get the very tiny leaves. These are what we can call leptophils, very tiny leaves, often toothed. And this is the rather inconspicuous fruit of Nothofagus cunninghami. Then we have the issue I want to say the most about, but I've got maybe 4 minutes to do it. And this is the issue of myrtle wilt. There in Tasmania's rainforests, I've got a young roadside tree that has been recently infected by this indigenous fungus, Phyllara australis, whose infection actually blocks the waterways of the tree. The entire crown dies, hence we call it a wilt. And myrtle wilt is a natural phenomenon which used to occur at a frequency that was able to be compensated by recruitment within patches within the forest. Now we have an FFG listing. There's another FFG listed species over there in the Otways rainforest. You can see it over there. That happens to be Taulostelia. But we now have a listed threat, which is human activity, which induces epidemic levels of myrtle wilt. And this was most observable in the Otways because the Otways have no other intervening dominant tree to break up the continuity of the root systems, because these trees, as people these days hear a lot about, they hold hands underground, and you can actually communicate from one tree to the next and spread the infection by this fungus from the initially infected tree, infected by spore, usually wind dispersed, occasionally water dispersed, and now it moves and creates a growing gap. And those gaps are so severe that when you see, firstly, there's my Swiss Army pocket knife, which I have in my pocket here to show you I'm still carrying the same knife 40 or 30 years later. And that the frass that you see comes from a beetle, which is also a secondary agent, not of dispersal, but it's an indicator in the field that you've got myrtle wilt. Here we have in a Triplet Falls, in one of the sites of state significance in the Otways, we have a more mature tree that's actually now in the second year of infection, where the foliage, having turned autumn colours in the first year, as you saw there, that's autumn colours in the first year, and then you get this washed out colour, a bit like leaves that are by that stage ready to fall onto the ground, and you have a highly threatened listed species, state and federally listed, threatened tree fern, slender tree fern, Cyathea cunninghami, dependent on the condition and the continuity and the fire-free condition of these mature forests for its survival. And now we have the beginnings of a wilt gap, which looks eventually, we'll come to that. There's on the far right, the person who did the most intensive mapping of forests in the Otways. For 17 years, he worked for the Forest Commission, which was my first employer out of university. And Ian Roberts, who lives at Forest with a double R, just to the northeast of the rainforest zone of the Otways, quite close to where we learned earlier about Lake Elizabeth. In fact, Lake Elizabeth was created by landfall, by the blocking of a river channel in my lifetime. We heard about that at the beginning of today. And so Ian Roberts did the mapping, not only of all of the forest types in the Otways, he also mapped every single wilt-affected tree that he could see on air photographs. So he came with me and my colleague that you see on the left and the pilot to fly over various parts of Victoria to actually map and plot the distribution of myrtle wilt seen from the air. I did this again in South Gippsland with Hancock's, a team of their people. I don't have time to tell you about how uninspired I was by the representative of the company. And this is what you see from the air. So you see a recent infection tree, Nothofagus, next to it an older one where all of the foliage has already fallen, and other healthy parts of the canopy, and the tree fern in the understory, and the eucalypts on the drier, more elevated adjacent sites. And then we have Pete Green, who's a member of the Scientific Advisory Committee, a lecturer at La Trobe University, where I've done all of my university work. I still am about to go on. John Morgan, the person on the right, I'll be with him on a student field trip in a few months' time. We're standing next to one of the myrtle wilt killed trees, or so we thought, in the monitoring plots that I established back in the early 90s. And we thought at the time, and everybody thought, that myrtle wilt killed the tree which became infected. Now, we saw, to our astonishment, I've seen a few instances of this, a few little branchlets that are, I know it's washed out, but this is in the depths of the rainforests of the Otways. You see that that big tree on the right, that Nothofagus, has got a tiny amount of resprouting, meaning that it's not completely dead a couple of decades after initial infection, when we set that up as the affected monitoring tree. We also had control plots with unaffected trees. Yes, we need to wrap up. I want to at least have included what these gaps look like. This is further down the Air Valley Road. Incidentally, this site was also a site where I brought a palynologist from Monash University to do core sampling, and she wrote up a paper, Michael may know that work, where she showed the vegetation history within the context of rainforest in the Otways. That's Myrna Mackenzie. Yes, so Myrna Mackenzie, I actually brought her to this site, and she and her husband took core samples and then wrote up a paper based on having looked at the depositional site, depositional habitat within that rainforest. And I don't have time to go into predictive modelling, but the rest of the other half of my presentation is just as fascinating, but I'm sorry I've run out of time. I should just preface, I should have prefaced what I've presented by the fact that my presentations are legendary for running over time, and I'm often doing it to places where people are sitting on the ground under a big tarpaulin out in the forest, and I go on and on till the last person lies down to sleep, which is usually around midnight. So, there we go.
Thanks, David. A round of applause for all the speakers. People travel and prepare. Yeah. All right. Morning tea brought to you by Beacon Ecological. I can do advertising. You've got half an hour. Can everyone please be back and seated by like in half an hour?